Welcome aboard Rocket Ship, the platform with the most relevant content for competitive examinations. This is Rocket Ship IAS Lab and continuing with our series on answer writing for General Studies papers of Civil Service Main Examination. We take up a question that you might come across in GS paper 3. Please read out the question carefully. If India is to deliver on the promises of a welfare state, improving its tax-GDP ratio is of vital importance. Briefly discussing the reasons why tax-GDP ratio remains low in India, suggest measures to ensure a sustained increase in tax-GDP ratio. So you can understand that the question has three major parts. In the first part, you have to basically establish a connection between high tax GDP ratio and the promises of a welfare state. We would discuss what the concept of welfare state means according to our interpretation. In the second part, you have to at first talks about the reasons why tax GDP ratio remains low in India, and you have to then talk about what are the measures which would lead to improvement in this scenario, that is increasing the tax GDP ratio in the case of India. As you can understand, these measures, that is the measures to improve on tax GDP ratio, would essentially deal with interventions that would deal with the regions, that is they would try to resolve some of the reasons why tax GDP ratio remains low in India. And before we introduce our answer, we have to make a suggestion. We would strongly suggest you that you make small notes, because this question is going to be quite heavy in statistics. We would discuss, actually we would mention a number of statistics, and you won't be able to keep track of all those statistics. Actually you won't be able to recall these statistics, which are very vital for your actual examination, if you do not have your notes handy. So we would again suggest you make make short notes and include some of the important statistics that we discussed today. With this, we introduce our answer, that is India spends barely 3.3% on pensions. This is much low as compared to our peers like China, where expenditure on pensions is almost 5.5%. So the point is, a welfare state has certain attributes, and one of its attributes is the provision of public assistance. We would repeat it, as the concept of welfare state is generally understood. A welfare state provides for, you could say, handsome public assistance in cases of, for an example, old age, unemployment, or for that matter disability, etc. And one of the ways to ensure this is through pensions or allowances. This story continues with health spending as well, which is barely 1.9% of GDP in India. And you can understand it's almost 4 times in the case of China, where it is 7.19%. India also underinvests in future, evident in its expenditure on research and development. That is India's investment in research and development, which is a paltry 0.65% of GDP. India's investment in research and development is a paltry 0.65% of GDP, which while it is almost 4 times in the case of China, where it is 2.68%. So again, as we were pointing out, that you have to note down these statistics. What we suggest you, that rather than going for the exact figure, you round off these figures and try to make them more relatable, more recallable. Actually, it is often attributable, that is all of these problems, that is India's low expenditure on various welfare measures, etc. It is often attributable to lack of resources with government, a point driven forth by India's low tax GDP ratio of 11.7%. This is a more comfortable 20% in China. So again, as we could make it more simple, India's tax GDP ratio at 11.7% is barely 55% of China's ratio, which is 20%. That is China's figure as in coming to tax GDP ratio is 20%, and in India's case that is almost 55% of the figure for China, that is barely 11.7%, handing them, that is the Chinese, more resources to spend on welfare measures. An interplay of structural, systemic, and operational issues share the blame for India's low tax GDP ratio. That is, some of the issues that lead to low tax GDP ratio are systemic, that is, they are more structural in nature, while the others are day-to-day issues or operational issues. Resolving these issues can help garner more resources in the form of taxes. Again, this point is very, very intuitive, that if we could deal with these issues, we can actually lead to greater tax GDP ratio for India. Now coming to this question, why low tax GDP ratio persists in India? These are due to a number of reasons. This is due to a number of reasons. First is the large share of informal economy. As we would see that a very large proportion of Indians are actually engaged in informal economy, and this means that they do not have the capacity, that they do not have the income levels to actually pay taxes. They do not even come into tax bracket. Then come systemic issues like corruption and black money, and due to this due to corruption and black money, a very large proportion of the economy is actually considered shadow economy that escapes taxation. Actually, it cannot be taxed in the first instance. Complicated registration and compliance requirements, which often puts off the for example, some business person who is actually willing to register for you could say taxes. For example, if someone is willing to register for GST, the entire process is so convoluted, it's so complicated, and often there are demands for various forms of bribe, etc., that sometimes it's frustrating for the businessman, and he would even drop the idea of registering for GST. Convoluted resolution process, which has given rise to a very high proportion of tax disputes. You could say a very large sum is actually stuck in tax disputes due to the convoluted resolution process, and even to the fact, it can be also attributed to the fact that the tax law in India is not clear. Moreover, this is a point that has been in debate lately, that is due to low standards of public service, which demotivates the taxpayers. As you can understand that the taxpayer does not expect to get anything in return from paying taxes, because he sees that the quality of service delivery in India is very, very poor. To be very frank, India's service delivery quality, the public service delivery quality in India remains poor, and therefore the taxpayer does not see much, you could say, benefit in paying taxes in the first instance. So he is not willing to pay taxes voluntarily. Anyway, detailing on these points, by some estimates, this is again a very, very important piece of statistics, almost 90% of the workforce is in informal employment, with wages barely covering their basic sustenance. They do not have the capacity to pay taxes. The point is, they do not have formal jobs, or for that matter, you could say job security, etc. And due to these reasons, they are not even in the tax bracket. They do not even come under the tax bracket. Corruption and black money create a shadow economy that escapes attention of tax authorities. A straightaway point: small businesses are often put off by complicated requirements of registering and complying with tax system, as we were trying to see through the example of a small business person who is put off by the complicated process that is required to register for GST. The arbitrary and convoluted nature of India's tax administration and tax code means a large amount of more than rupees 15 lakh crore is stuck in disputes. This results in reduced tax realization. Again, this is a quite ironical that in a country like ours, where the government is often starved of resources, often starved of revenues, a very large sum, a princely sum actually, of 15 lakh crore is stuck in disputes. And the point is, even if we could resolve some of the disputes, even a small part of this dispute, that sum would still go a long way for, you could say, underwriting the welfare requirements of Indians. It is observed that where citizens see their taxes spent on quality public service, they voluntarily pay taxes. Despite some improvement in public services in India, despite some improvements, public services in India still leave much to be desired. The point is, there has been some improvement going down back to 1947, that has been seen in India's public service delivery. Nowadays, it's much improved than the earlier days. But again, this still has a large gap compared to other nations of the world. So the point is, as the service quality remains low in India, the citizen, the taxpayer does not see much benefit in paying taxes voluntarily. He is actually forced to pay these taxes. Now, low tax GDP ratio is the result of many factors as discussed above. Any intervention to improve the situation must focus on. So what are the some of the interventions and what they should focus on? Improving tax GDP ratio comes down to increasing the or the widening the tax base, as we were talking about. As more and more people actually join the formal economy, they would be in a condition, they would be in a position to pay taxes, and this would actually widen the tax base. Improved tracking of transactions, for an example, through cashless transactions, the requirement of cashless transactions, and value added taxation. The concept of value added taxation means that we can actually tax based on the actual value added in each stage. For an example, from say the wholesaler to retailer stage, if there is a markup by X%, the actual tax would be calculated on this X%, and this X% is actually quite easier to calculate in the case of GST, because we are actually able to see how much has been the increase in the price between the wholesaler and the retailer. That is called value added tax. What has been the addition of to value during this stage, that is between the wholesaler to the retailer, and we can actually going to tax this value added. This is actually more simpler and easier to track, which is one of the, you could say, attributes of GST as well. Making tax code and administration more taxpayer friendly, as we would see later through various measures. Improving quality of service, as we were talking about, as the citizens see the quality of service improving, they are more willing to pay taxes, and this can be done through e-governance, guarantee laws, etc. We would discuss the concept of guarantee laws shortly. Elaborating on these points, in one of his Man Ki Baat address to the nation, Honorable Prime Minister had dwelt on how pulling more people out of poverty would not only widen the tax base but also reduce burden on mostly middle class, honest taxpayers. So the need is more than ever to focus on targeted measures to improve people's finances. Schemes like Mudra, PM Swanidhi, that is Street Vendor Atmanirbhar Nidhi. We would repeat it. PM Swanidhi stands for Street Vendor Atmanirbhar Swanidhi, etc. might help in ensuring economic mobility of the masses, for the masses. So the point is, as more and more people actually become more mobile, more economically mobile, they would actually join the tax paying bracket. That would mean that not only the entire tax kitty would actually expand, but it would also mean that the tax burden on the individual honest taxpayer, who are mostly middle class, would decrease. The average tax burden on average middle class person would actually decrease if more and more people were to join the tax bracket. Then, with the advent of GST, which keeps a tab of value addition, as we were trying to see through the example of value addition between the wholesaler and the retailer, at each step of a business, that the GST, which keeps a tab of value addition at each step of a business transaction, it is difficult to evade taxes. Not entirely impossible, but it is nowadays difficult to evade taxes. Requirement of cashless transactions and people becoming more aware of things like benefits of invoicing, that is their demand for bill tax compliance would actually improve. Now coming to making the tax administration more taxpayer friendly, self-service like e-filing and reduction in human interface that often turned into an avenue for corruption are some of the measures to make tax administration more taxpayer friendly. The point is, through measures like e-filing, self-service, etc., and moreover reducing the requirement of human interface that is going to meet a public servant time and again, which often led to corruption due to, you could say, various forms of kickback that the public servant required, for example a tax official, etc. Nowadays there is a greater chance of compliance. Moreover, it is easier for a, you could say, taxpayer to for example register for taxation, etc., for even, for example, make filings, etc. Moreover, to reduce tax disputes, the tax laws should be clarified and the role of tax tribunals, arbitration and mediation should also be emphasized. Actually, we would suggest that the government should actually honor the awards of the tax tribunals, or for that matters whatever has been you could say awards that have been made by the arbitration or the mediation professionals, tribunals, etc. E-governance has a role in ensuring timely and quality service. So we were talking about service quality. One of the measures through which we can improve on service quality is through e-governance. Moreover, many laws like service guarantee acts should be enforced in their true spirit. Actually, these are a class of laws that were passed by various states. That is, the service guarantee acts were a class of laws that were passed by many states, which were actually meant to ensure that the citizen would be delivered a certain quality of service. Generally, these laws, that is the service guarantee laws, they generally focused on, you could say, timely service delivery. But the point is, they can improve on service quality to some extent. Common goods like, now we are again touching on the concept of common goods like physical infrastructure, health services, etc., should get more focus so that taxpayers see the benefit in enthusiastically paying taxes. If space and time permits, you would like to cite the example or mention the example of the Scandinavian countries. Generally, these countries, for example, Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, etc., they have high tax rates. Still, after that, despite that, they do have great tax compliance, which is often attributable to provision of welfare measures like unemployment benefits, pensions, etc., and moreover free education, healthcare, etc. With these, the taxpayer is actually incentivized to pay taxes voluntarily despite the tax rate being high, because he understands that he would be getting something in return out of his payment of taxes. If he were to pay taxes, the government is going to build, you could say, something of common good, something that would ensure common good. For example, healthcare infrastructure, or for that matter, if he were to someday face a situation like unemployment, or for that matter disability, government would be willing to pay him various forms of social assistance like pension or unemployment allowances, etc. Due to this expectation of getting something in return out of paying taxes, the average taxpayer in the Scandinavian country is more willing to pay taxes in the first instance. This is what has been suggested by scholars everywhere actually. In case of India too, it would apply that India should actually try to improve on the quality of service that we deliver to the common citizen. That way the common citizen would be more willing, and in fact he would voluntarily, you could say, pay taxes. This was the long and short of India's low tax GDP ratio, the reasons why it remains low, and what can be done to improve on this situation. With this, we call it a day. We would bring you another lecture in a few days. As usual, we wish you all the best. Thank you.